Stick around until the end of this video, and I'm going to explain why President Zelensky is waiting for an opportune moment to attack, and why that's going to be a little bit further in the future than many people are expecting. Starting off with the first obvious sign and reason why Zelensky is waiting is because there is an ongoing offensive in the Bakhmut area. The first and second battles of Bakhmut have been incredibly intense and also led to a very high amount of Russian casualties. Somewhere around 8,000 killed in the first battle, and we believe around 4,000 killed at this current moment on the 9th of December in the second battle of Bakhmut. While it has been incredibly intense during the second battle, after President Putin's address the other day saying that the war was entering a protracted phase and it would take a little bit longer than they expected, the one thing that is very interesting is that this battle has also gone on the back burner as well, and it's started to get a little less intense, and Russian casualties have dropped as well, which is showing that Russian units are coming into less contact with Ukrainian troops. This is an incredibly important thing to emphasize and talk about, because this is showing that the Russians, and our assumption initially that they are trying to survive the winter, is true, and here's the reason why. This battle is keeping the Ukrainians focused in one spot with a large amount of reserves in the rear around the area of Bakhmut to make sure that the Russians do not break through in this area and take the town. By that reason alone, the Ukrainians cannot launch any offensives right now, because if they do, they have to remove those reserves out of the area into other parts of the front lines, and if they try and do that, let's say the Russians tack on an additional 2 or 3 BTGs, throw a suicidal breakthrough at the chicken tender and take the chicken tender, and now they're pushing up the highway towards Chasiv Yar and down into Bakhmut, largely without a massive deal of resistance. There wouldn't be any reserves to counter that push if it was to happen, and so all Ukrainian offensives have to be put on hold until they have the proper force size to conduct an offensive in that area, and that's entirely reliant on the reserves in Bakhmut being moved to those directions. And so right now, there will not be any offensives just for that reason alone, that the Ukrainians have to wait out the current attack in Bakhmut, and now we can see what the Russians are really trying to do by putting this thing on a very slow burning pace at this point. They're not actually trying to take the town of Bakhmut anymore, due to them, of course, once again drawing their forces largely out of the battle, and now it's a small simmering battle. They're just trying to keep these Ukrainian forces distracted so that way they can't launch offensives in other areas, and they have to wait just in case if there is a worst case scenario where they do break through the Bakhmut area. So now we know, and putting all that together, putting all the pieces together, the plan of the Russians is to try and hold up the Ukrainians into one spot and make sure that they can't conduct any offensives and keep defensive until the winter is over, because by then it will have been nearly a half year since the past partial mobilization was called. They can call up another one, which will then help them to once again replace all of the combat attrition that they've taken and all of their units on the front lines, every BTG, and especially the ones that are in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk area and the ones that are currently engaged in the first and second battle of Bakhmut. Those units could finally get some kind of replacements. And another thing, now this is also incredibly important, I have seen some people saying on the last video, and it's actually blown up, it's gotten 170,000 views I believe at this point, and I have seen some people in the comment section along with some Russian bots, which I'm thinking about doing a addressing the bots video. Let me know in the comment section if you'd like to see that. But I've seen some people saying the partial mobilization that the Russians called up, the 300,000, aren't actually replacing any casualties. They're just adding to the number of Russian forces. But based off of the kill count that the Russians have and also the wounded count, the only thing they can be doing is replacing the ones they've lost. And so we know that the Russians aren't bolstering their numbers and growing them in any meaningful way, and these soldiers aren't equipped with modern equipment to actually even be usable. So we know that they're entirely just replacing all of the casualties they've taken so far, and that once again shows and furthers the idea that this is nothing more than a stalling tactic to make sure that the Ukrainians don't conduct an offensive until at least after the next partial mobilization, so that way maybe they can actually bolster the numbers a little bit. At that point, they may be able to increase the size of the Russian army in Ukraine by about 40 or 50,000 personnel, although they'll still be poorly trained, and they'll still be poorly equipped, and they still won't be paid, and they'll still be rioting, and all that, and they probably won't have commanders. But moving beyond all of the pitfalls of the Russians, because the bots would have you believe that they're the most glorious thing on earth, they're still doing a stall tactic in this area. But moving from the Ukrainians having to be a reactive force based off of what the Russians are currently doing on the front lines, there are behind the lines logistical reasons that they're waiting for a more opportune time. Once again, much like the Russians are being affected by the winter weather, the Ukrainians appear to also be affected by the winter weather as well. We haven't seen any major activities in the areas north of Severodonetsk and Rubizhny and Kremenna, which shows that this area, which has been covered with snow for about the past 3 weeks, is facing some probably significant logistical issues on both sides. Road conditions are incredibly poor in this area. Vehicles can slide off the road due to ice, or they can get stuck in muddy roads because the snow has melted in some instances, and this is causing the logisticians to have an incredibly hard time supplying those frontline units with any of the supplies they need. And so now these superb Ukrainian supply lines that were able to supply perishable items like raw meats and chocolate cakes are probably not able to supply those things, but they are still getting the basic necessities and requirements of these units. But still, that's not good enough, especially for an offensive, considering that there has to be a massive buildup of supplies and a massive use of trucks and vehicles to build up, I guess you could say, log bases or logistics bases that have enough supplies for an offensive to carry out. They would require a high rotation, I guess you could say a turnaround time for these convoys. They would have to arrive at the logistics base in a matter of a few hours, drop off the supplies, and be back in time for the next round of supplies to get an offensive ready. And you can't really do that in the winter weather because the road conditions are so poor that these vehicles and convoys are having to travel at a much slower speed, so that way they don't end up crashing and also losing the supplies. And so everything is operating at a reduced rate and speed. And so if the Ukrainians want to conduct an offensive in this northern area, they're probably going to be waiting for more amicable weather sometime around early February, so that way then they can launch an assault, and hopefully either the ground has frozen so well that they can pull it off, which we also saw the Russians do on February 24th. It seems as though they were chancing the idea at that point that the Rasputitsa wouldn't be in season yet. The ground wouldn't be a slush. It would actually be a hard, solid, frozen piece of permafrost that they could drive over, and they could get the entire offensive operation done in about 3 days, so the permafrost would be out of the picture. But right now, with this war obviously going on an incredibly long time and looking like it will still be going on for quite some while in the future, the Ukrainians have to prepare for an offensive in February and hope that they can take a swath of ground, maybe Svatove, by the time that offensive would round out. The Rasputitsa would come through, they would go through another lull, and then offensive operations would begin after the Rasputitsas ended sometime in April, most likely mid-April. And so that's another reason why we're not seeing the Ukrainians pulling off an offensive. The third reason, which isn't really the most important one, and these are actually listed in priority, these 3 reasons. The third one would be that the Ukrainians are waiting for more Western equipment. We already know that they're being supplied quite well with ammunition, and I guess you could say the secondary supplies that are needed to keep the primary supplies operating. Things like the Krabs, the Panzerhaubitze 2000s, the Gepards, such things like that. They require secondary supplies, and I call those primary because that's the first thing you think of on the supply chain of getting those things there, but then you have to keep them running, and that's what the secondary supplies are for, and they have to keep up a constant stream of those, and we know that the Ukrainians do have them. However, we know that they're still waiting for more primary supplies because the more they're able to phase out the older Soviet equipment that the Ukrainian army was using at the start of this war and bring in more modern and advanced Western equipment like M777s to replace the D-20s and D-30s with, they will be in a better off position offensively. We also hear that the Germans are supposing and planning to send Leopard 2A4s into Ukraine, and so if they can wait for those as well, that will give them a little bit of an upper edge against the Russians, considering that a Leopard 2A4 is by far more superior technologically and in its abilities than a T-72B or a T-80BV is. We don't see any more of, in large numbers at least, of the more advanced and high-end mechanized and armored forces like the T-80Us or the T-80BVMs or the T-90Ms or T-90As. It appears that most of those have either been rotated out of the theater or they've been destroyed, one or the other. And so we know that they'll be going up against largely older vehicles, and even then the Leopard 2A4 would be able to match the most modern Russian tanks in their abilities, but right now the Leopard 2 would be leaps and bounds over enemy armor if it had to come into contact with it and fight against it, and also it's better against anti-tank guided missile systems because the Leopard 2A4, from what we know, has more armor built into it than a T-72B has, even with the additional add-on armor ERA tiles that's put all over the tank. So That's another reason, just a singular example of why the Ukrainians are also waiting for probably more Western primary supplies, because with those, they can help themselves get a better offensive edge for the offensives coming months later. And so, for all three of those reasons, that's probably why we're seeing that the Ukrainians aren't conducting any offensives and they're just biding their time in Bakhmut, grinding down the Russian forces that are engaged in a small battle there at the moment. And once that battle ends, they're going to move their reserve forces into other areas of the front lines, probably with more Western equipment and more favorable weather conditions, so that way they can then push the offensives there. And so with that, I hope I answered the question as to why Zelensky is waiting for a better time to attack, and I thank you all so much once again for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, please make sure to hit the like button, comment, and subscribe, because that, of course, helps this channel a whole load, and we love to know that people enjoy this content. If you also enjoyed it a great deal and you want to support us so that way we can keep making this, please go to our Patreon and support us there. The link is in the description below, and if you join the Patreon, you help me to continue to make these videos, because that's the only way we actually do that on the side. And so with that, I thank you all so much once again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. And also, by the way, before I move on, if y'all also want to see me respond to bots in the comments section, let me know in the comments below. I'll put up a pinned comment down there, and so if you want that, let me know, and we might actually try and make one today if I have the time. But once again, I will see you all around.